to the other one.
And all right.
I will say no.
I'm going to give it a couple more minutes. We're just a little bit early.
Oh my gosh.
I'll cut off the beginning of the video before publishing. Holy cow.
I'm leaving.
I thought you were going to come in and heckle.
Oh yeah, that's right. Wait, see what I did there?
Yeah, but you can't go out and heckle.
Well, that was heckling. Never mind. You just keep watching your VHS over there.
I feel like a kid again. This thing wasn't even hidden. It was just sitting on top of the counter here. I'm going to give it another minute just to, yeah.
Are you good?
Yeah, we're good.
Oh, you already got it?
Sure, help me out.
Good, good.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, maybe anytime.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name's Jesse Taylor. You can find me online as ToppleStack, either on Drupal or Slack or just about anywhere else. Slides are available at the URL below the title there, and pretty much all the documentation for this presentation is at getcomposer.org. So really quickly, how many of you are using Composer? How many of you are kind of at that stage where you really want to get into Drupal 8, but Composer is kind of one of those things that you don't know that's kind of keeping you from getting started? Okay. That's sort of what this presentation is about, is how to get from where you're at now to being able to use Composer to manage a Drupal 8 site. I'm not an expert on this. My introduction of it took place about 7 months ago. I started a new job working as a contractor. My client says, hey, we've got this big project. It's a migration from a non-Drupal, massive non-Drupal project over to Drupal, and we want you to do it in Drupal 8. Here's all the requirements. Have at it. Working from home, there wasn't anybody to consult with on it, really. They didn't have anybody. They had one Drupal 8 site, but it really wasn't built using Composer. It was put together really, really early. And pretty much by like Drupal 8.2, if you weren't using Composer, it was to the point where you couldn't do Drupal 8 without Composer. So that's where we're at today. So what is Composer? How many of you are familiar with like the apt-get or yum Linux? How many of you use NVM, Node Version Manager for front-end stuff, or Bundler? So Composer isn't quite like apt-get or yum, but in some ways it is. It pulls from an online repository of projects called packages, same as NVM and Bundler. In fact, it's highly inspired by both of those. How many of you have built Drupal sites using Makefiles in the past? 2. Okay. This pretty much takes the place of that. And so what I'm going to go over in this is I'm going to be going over some of the basic Composer commands that you'll run into, you'll find yourself using on a typical Drupal project. I'm also going to go over the structure of the Composer JSON file, what everything means, what it means to you as far as building and managing a Drupal site. And then towards the end, if there's time, we'll go over like the Git structure, what folders should be excluded, what folders should be included, so that you can continue to manage and maintain your site using version control. But there's some things that you want in Git, and there's some things that you just want to leave and let Composer handle. So from there, we'll get into it. Getting Composer, if you're on a Windows-based system using Cygwin or their little hybrid Ubuntu Bash, or on any Linux system, you can use the above. On OS X, if you're using a Mac, I highly recommend Homebrew to install all of that and manage things. And the common commands. So there's a lot more commands. The link at the bottom provides a list to all of the CLI commands, CLI commands, and pretty much all of the details, all of the flags and everything that can be used. But in general, these are the ones that I use the most, and in pretty much the order that you would use them in the process of putting together and managing a Drupal site. So getting into the first one is Composer Init. This is basically similar to doing Git Init. It initializes a Composer project. And in this situation, we're not really going to use this very much. If you get to the point where you're comfortable with Composer and want to do something really, really custom, you get into this. But it does sort of have an interactive walkthrough, and its job is basically to build the foundation of your Composer JSON file, which you can then add to and build your project from there. So if you're doing something outside of Drupal and using Composer, something else Symfony-based, like Laravel, something like that, you might look into doing something with this, something custom. I don't use it very much, but it's sort of that very first step. I recommend, if you're really wanting to get familiar with Composer, to start off here, because you'll get a little bit of familiarity of what's going on before you jump in to Composer Create Project. And this is what you'll run when you're very first starting a Drupal project. So the first one up there is basically sort of the official Drupal project. What this command does is it reaches out, is going to grab the official Drupal Composer JSON file and some other files and everything associated with it. And it's going to create it. The no dev at the end, that's going to skip some development environment, basically packages. It's not going to pull them in. Below is what I use, the Drupal Composer Drupal project. This is sort of a collection of the current best practices for setting up a new Drupal 8 site. It's got a lot of the development packages that you're going to want. It's got a few other things, and we'll get into a lot of that later. But to create a Composer project here, I'll go over what all the different things are on that second command line there. You're just telling Composer to create a project. You're telling it that you want to grab the Drupal Composer, Drupal project, basically 8 dev version. It's going to install it. This is going to create a directory, whichever you specify as the my site dir. And this is specifying that I want the minimum stability of development version. What that is you could say I want the minimum stability of stable. And that means that it's not going to go out and grab any dev versions of any packages. It's only going to reach out and grab stable. With the way Drupal 8 is right now, a lot of stuff I've done, you're actually pretty lucky to actually have a dev version. That's changed over the past 3 months or so. A lot of modules have kind of matured to the point where they actually have a dev version. Some of them are actually out of the point where they actually have a full stable version and they're not on an alpha or a beta release. But a lot of contrib modules are still sort of in that stage. And then the no interaction at the end, that just basically means that Composer create project isn't going to come up and ask me any questions as it goes through and creates the project. Where Composer init, that's basically what it's there for, is it's going to go through and ask you those questions. And it would just pretty much pre-populate a Composer JSON file. And we'll get into what part of that it creates in a bit. Next, this is when we move on to the site building. Composer require is how you install Drupal modules. You're not going to do, in fact, do not use DrushDL to download a Drupal module in Drupal 8. You will not get all of its dependencies. With Drupal 8, Drupal 8 is a Symfony package, Symfony project. And there's a lot of things that go into what's called the vendor file that a lot of your modules, a lot of core relies on. And if you pull a module down using Drush, it will not have those dependencies. So Composer require, it's fairly simple. It's Drupal / and then if you want to go out to D.O and look for a project on there, whatever that project's name is what you're going to put in as the module name. And then if you're looking for a specific version, you can put a version there. Otherwise, it's just going to grab the latest stable version. So that's kind of what I have as as examples below. And then the bottom on the top one there, it's let's say we want to use Behat for local testing. The dev flag at the end means it's going to put it in another section of your Composer file, your Composer JSON file. So there's one section is what's necessary for your project, and then there's module, let's say devel. You want to use that locally for local testing, site building, but you don't want that on your production server. That puts it in a different section of your Composer file so that it can still be included. Everybody who's working and collaborating on your project will be able to get those local development dependencies installed, but it's not going to go out to any of your production sites. And then Composer remove, you don't have to worry about versions or anything on there. Actually, I need to change that. That should say Composer remove Drupal module name. And then the update with dependencies just means it's going to go out and it's going to check for any unused dependencies in your Composer project and remove those. If you don't have that on there, you could end up removing a module, but you still have some leftover dependencies. Think of it as that annoying thing when somebody disables a module in Drupal 7 and then deletes the module but didn't actually uninstall it. It's not going to have any immediate negative effects, but as your project grows and matures and everything, you can run into some problems there. Composer install. This is what you're going to run after you pull a repo. This is what you're going to run after you deploy. What it basically does is it's going to read your composer.json and it's going to compare it to your composer lock file. When you create a project and pull a project in, it's going to create a lock file. And what that lock file has in it is what specific versions were being used of each module or each PHP package at the time that the lock file was created. So the lock file is what keeps everybody who's collaborating on a site all using the exact same versions of your modules. And that is in contrast to Composer Update. Now, at the top, we have just Composer Update, which is going to go through your entire project, and it's going to update everything. It's going to update all of your modules to the latest version allowable by your JSON file, which is not a good idea. Anytime you run things, this is like just running a flat-out drush up and not being particular about which modules are being updated, except there's actually a lot more going on here. It's not just Drupal-specific stuff, but it's also Symfony dependencies that your site is relying on that could change. Some modules are requiring specific versions of Symfony packages. So what's the better thing is to run Composer Update, specify the individual module, and then once again we have with dependencies. What that's going to do is it's going to go out and check for any dependency updates that module relies on or that core relies on, and it's going to pull those in. And then there's a disclaimer down there at the bottom. I always recommend running a git diff after running Composer Update. Most of the stuff that Composer is going to be pulling in isn't going to be checked in to your Git repository, but there are some things like your Drupal scaffolding, that's your robots, your htaccess, your index.php, those are all the Drupal scaffolding files. Those you do want to have checked in to your Git repository, and when you update core and pull those scaffold files in, those could change. So it's a good idea to always check. And those files in your Drupal root are usually the ones that you're going to catch. You may have rarely a settings file or something like that you need to pay attention to, but that's not incredibly common. So I also want to touch on when to use Composer install and when to use Composer update. I've been through a lot of online documentation, and this wasn't incredibly clear at first. And there's a lot of people who have been doing this for a while that at least I feel don't present this properly. If you run Composer Update when you're deploying to a server, you can very easily end up with a newer version of a module than what you had on your local or dev servers. So anytime you're deploying, you want to use Composer install. And you want to use usually Composer install with the no dev flag that I mentioned earlier. That will basically, it's going to install all of your required for your project, but it's not going to pull in any of the required dev, which are basically your development tools that are included in your project. We'll get into that a little. That'll become a little bit more evident when we get into the JSON structure itself. Composer outdated is a way you run this in your command line, and it will go through and it will tell you all of the projects, or excuse me, packages that are updated or outdated. So you might go through and you might notice in Drupal, it might be telling you that you have a couple modules that are updated, or there are updates for. But you've got a lot more in Drupal 8 than just Drupal packages now. You have other Symfony framework packages that could be affecting the use of your site. You may have some development packages that you're only using on dev that may have some updates for. There may be an update for PHP unit or Behat or some of your other testing tools. Composer validate. After you've added some changes to your Composer JSON file, you always want to run Composer validate. This is just going to go through and make sure that your Composer JSON file is valid JSON. You want to run this before you commit anything. It's just going to go through and make sure that basically your Composer file is going to work, so that you don't have any problems locally. And once again, I'd always recommend running it with dependencies. There's other Composer dependencies, even outside of your project, that can sometimes have an effect on it. Composer search. I'm going to pick on the Superfish module here.
Please do.
I'm picking on this one because it was in one of our projects, and we were doing it one way, and there's some changes to how we need to be pulling it in. Not that I'm a fan or not a fan of the module in any way. But running Composer search Superfish, I'll actually pull this over. And this is going to come up with all of the available modules, or excuse me, packages. Modules, packages, projects, all get so confusing. That's kind of over the edge of the screen. Let me see if I can get that more centered. No, that didn't really change anything. But this is going to pull up anything that's related to Superfish. So Superfish is a JSON library that is usually used with menus. So you can see that there's a lot of menu modules for Drupal that come up. There's also a few, like right here, we have the actual library that's required for the module. Not all modules, used to working in 7, you know that not all modules have the JSON library that they require, even PHP library included in them. So if I were to use the Superfish module, I would want to grab, see if I can see it here, both Drupal Superfish and the library in order for it to work. I'll swing back over here. And the N flag just means that it's only going to include modules with that in the name. So if I went back through and ran that again, it would only pull up ones that actually said Superfish. So some of those other Showcase Lite, nice menus, those wouldn't show up. It's only going to pull up with it in its name. Now, it's not smart enough to, if you misspell it, read your mind and find what you're looking for. So you have to know a little bit about what you're looking for in specifics, but you can kind of get a little bit of an idea. We could also do like a Composer search and then do, I'll actually pull it up here, we'll do. And that would pretty much do a search for all Drupal projects. Yeah, /star. So it's going to come up with a list of everything. It can be a little bit overwhelming on here, but let's say it's highly useful when you're in that situation where you've got a module that requires a library. You can check and see if there's already a Composer package available for that. There's other ways to pull in libraries if there's not, but this is, you would first do a search and check because that can save you a lot of effort. The other way requires you to manually go in and edit your JSON file. And then finally, just Composer Show. This is, once again, a lot of the same kind of commands as the search, but this can actually provide you with some details if you just want to confirm that the package that you're pulling in is what you're looking for without having to open up a web browser, internet, and look up that particular package. You can get it just right there in your shell. Have I lost anybody yet? You promised heckling and you're just sitting there quiet. I'm not going to complain. So I'm going to get into the Drupal Composer Drupal project a little bit. Once again, I kind of stated that this is like the current best practices, and they keep this fairly well up to date. This is a very active project. It's fairly safe to say that I think 30+% of all Drupal 8 sites that have been created will be created based on this sort of a framework or you know, starter kit. So we're going to get into the JSON structure or schema, and the URL at the bottom of the screen here is the URL to where you can look up all of the schema information for the JSON file. So this part here is are all of the parts that we're going to be going over. It's broken into I'd say about 3 different sections. The top section being information about the project itself, and then you get into what's included in the project, and then towards the bottom you get into some functionality in the JSON file that basically can help you as far as auto running and checking. Excuse me. Checking your project, as well as like automated scripts that you can run, as far as like Drush config imports that you can have run whenever Composer install runs, or you can get pretty specific on some of that. We'll get into that as we move down. Initial properties. If you've ever written a Drupal theme in Drupal 7 or a module or anything like that, this really isn't all that different. You basically just consider a lot of this the meta information about your project. The name would be the vendor. That's basically who built your project. And then afterwards, this is the name of the project. So, and any Drupal site that you build will be type project. If you're building packages, it's a little bit different. Excuse me, if you're building modules, it's a little bit different. I don't know that we'll really get into that during this session. Where I mentioned minimum stability dev when we did the create project, that puts that in there. And the prefer stable true means that it's going to prefer, if there is a stable version, it's going to prefer that over a dev version. But if there's only a dev version, it will still pull that and use that. Repositories. So the most important one, and the one that you'll see in every Drupal 8 project, is the Drupal packages. This is basically the URL where Composer is able to go out and look for all of the packages that are available for the Drupal project. This doesn't include the external Symfony projects. Those are all visible just through Composer by itself. You don't have to pull in a package in your JSON file in order to find any of those. This just pulls in basically all of the modules that are currently available on Drupal.org. This is what makes those available. Now, let's say I work for an organization that has a custom module or custom modules that are being used on multiple different sites, multiple different projects, which I really recommend. If you're writing a custom module, don't just check that in to your repository for the site. Create another repo for it and pull it in this way. It's a little bit more work to set it up, but it's a lot nicer. You can also, it helps you rely on Composer to check and make sure that everything's building properly.
Here's your echo.
Okay.
You intentionally leave the comment out so people will see what your GitHub name is.
No.
Oh, so insert some word, mean word value.
Yeah, you can.
Heckle.
Um,
Do you know what I'm talking about? Like this after yeah.
oh yeah. No, it was late last night and I was just typing. Unfortunately, none of
Look at his GitHub URL. He's so awesome.
Yeah.
See, there's that.
The repo name doesn't actually exist. You go to the URL, it'll be a 404. Yeah, I was just typing late last night and
It's
put
not
this in.
access key.
And then below I used, this is the Superfish library. One of our other developers put this in, like I said, not really realizing that there was already a Composer package that he could pull in to get that JavaScript library. So if the library isn't something that already has a package for it, you can basically outline it here. And where we say name, we'll get into it next on the require, but basically that's what you would require if you were going to pull this in. And we'll get into that here. So the Composer require command, this, like I mentioned, this is how you install a Drupal module. In this situation, vendor for most of our stuff is going to be Drupal. You'll notice in your developer tools and in here there's a few other things. Composer installers, the scaffolding, this is what pulls in the files for your root of your Drupal project. And then Drupal Composer, our Composer Manager, we'll get into in a little bit. That does one of the coolest improvements, I think, as far as managing a project from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, which is patches, but we'll get into that later. Once you run Composer require, it will show up in your JSON file in this list. So if I were to basically install a module, it'll show up there with the basically main version that you want installed. And you can also specify specific versions. If you want to get into the specifics, you can do Composer require, we'll say Drupal token, and then here we can do like 1.2-dev or whatever. I guess it would be 1.x-dev if it's a dev version. That'll get you the specific module. Also, when you're switching versions, if you want to switch from one version of a module to another, you don't run Composer update. You run Composer require and require that different version of the module that you want. And you'd want to run that, I showed earlier, with dependencies flag. It will remove the dependencies necessary for one version of the module and make sure that it installs the dependencies for the version that you're putting in. Otherwise, you can get into situations where you have the dependencies for, say, an earlier version of the module, but you're running a later version and you start to run into errors. Require dev. These are things like your PHP unit testing. You include like devel. I'm still more familiar with Drupal 7 than 8, so I just listed some of the Drupal modules that I would typically maybe include on for development, but I wouldn't want these present on a production box. And then we'll get into like the scripting a little bit later. I'm not going to go into much detail on that, but you can set up some scripting so that if it's if you run composer install without the no dev flag, it will automatically enable these modules, where if composer install is run with the no dev flag, it will disable the modules. So you're not in a situation where you have to worry about, oh, I've enabled this module, it's gone through the config export and everything, and now it's enabled on my production site. Not that that still doesn't happen sometimes. But. Does anybody have any questions so far on any of this? Everybody's just been really quiet.
I have a question.
Sure.
And I'm not sure if this is exactly related to what you're going through, but I plan on installing without using Composer and only using Composer for updates. Is this a good idea, or is this frowned upon?
I would highly recommend using Composer from the ground up.
Okay.
This seems daunting a little bit if you haven't used it, but believe me, this is the this way of maintaining a Drupal project is the one that has the least amount of headaches associated with it. No, you don't think so?
I've done it both ways. You can still get Drupal 8 with Drush.
Uh-huh.
Right? It's super easy to get with Drush. If you get it with Drush, then you can update it with Drush. If you get it with Composer, you can't update it with Drush.
Okay.
Right? You can still update your packages, and you can Composer update or Composer required, and still get the side benefits. But right now, there's still the sweet spot between Composer and Drush hasn't been found yet. And you still got Drupal console on the side of that too,
Yeah.
right? And there's some overlap on all three of those. Now, if what you're doing is building just Drupal 8 stuff, and you want the library stuff, Composer is going to be much easier to get all the other library stuff, right? But if what you're building is just with config modules, Drush is actually cleaner and easier.
Okay. I still use Drush a lot, just not for downloading modules. I use it for just about everything else, but as far as like actual maintaining of the repository and the site, I don't use Drush for that.
So this goes into my next question. I
Okay.
don't necessarily have a repository that I need to maintain. It's just I have it and I update it, and let's just say I'm the only one doing it, right? So why wouldn't I not just use the administrator toolbar to update my modules?
To be honest, I used to do that back in the past.
Okay.
But you run into a situation of what happens if you update that and it breaks your site. Which it can, and there's several modules that sometimes when they go from one version to another, they have a high chance of that, and some of them even require some additional effort and work to update from one version to another. So running it as a repository will help you roll back if you need to. So I've got that module, but now I need to switch to a previous version of the module, and meanwhile, you know, my site's down.
Yeah.
So
let's say that I'm doing that on like a development server.
It's a lot better than running on a production box, but
Right.
it's still like, you know, driving a car out on the Bonneville Salt Flats without a seatbelt.
Very fast, I guess.
Yeah. You don't realize how fast it is until the vehicle you're in comes to a sudden stop.
So okay, so the plan is to migrate the site from 7. I want to put 8.3.2.
Uh-huh.
Do it with Composer.
I absolutely recommend Composer.
Run the migrate module
Yeah.
And pray. Yes. Right?
Well, and then, yeah, and if we get to it, we're getting through these slides actually fairly fast. But on one of my last slides, I outline like what folders to include in your Git repo and which ones to exclude. At least from my opinion, what's worked well for us. When I started 7 months ago, that was my very first like, oh, this is a Drupal 8 site that I have to finish. I'm not just playing around with this. It's an actual project. And in that time, we've spun up about 5 others. A lot of them fairly small and simple, but others fairly complex. And we've kind of been working through how to really use Composer and leverage it to help automate the deployment process and everything. Composer really helps out with that too.
Answers, by the way.
Thank you. Auto load and scripts. So by default, this project has what's called a script handler, and the auto load means that it's automatically going to be pulled in, and then there's certain times when it gets fired. So if I run a pre-install command, it's going to check my actual local Composer version, make sure that I'm on at least the minimum Composer version required by my project. It's also going to check that when I update. So if my local Composer is out of date, it can update that. There's also a post-install command and a post-update command. So these are situations where, like I mentioned, you can set up. It's a JSON file. You can go in, or excuse me, it's a JavaScript file. You can go in and set up certain scripts to run different shell commands and different things like that. So like I said, on a post install, I can check for that no dev flag. If that's there, I could have certain modules disabled, things like that. Just a note, config export and config import will overwrite these settings. So you have to be a little bit careful there. That's basically the config import, config export in Drupal 8. It's similar to, a little bit similar to features in Drupal 7. If you use that, that basically exports all of your site configuration. It'll export your content types. It exports pretty much everything. And you can check that into your Git repo. So you can make sure that you can reproduce things and that everything's pretty much the same. You can push up settings. For Drupal 7, you'd have to go into like the admin console and change something in production, which can be a little bit risky. Or you do it through Drush, where you push a variable. The config export allows you to replicate the exact configuration from one environment to another. So these are the auto load and scripts is where you can kind of call some of that stuff and automate some of your deployment. You can do other stuff in Git hooks. If you're really familiar with Git and comfortable with it, get into some Git hooks where when the repo is pulled, it'll automate and run some things, which we still do. We're still sort of transitioning into getting it to where it's all automated by Composer instead of some other external stuff. Now, at the very bottom, we have the extra part. This is where you set up your Drupal directory structure. So with Composer, one of the things that's recommended is that you don't install Drupal in the root of your Composer project. You install it in a subdirectory, typically web, and that's so that your vendor folder, which contains a lot of your dependencies and everything, is separate. And I also recommend that like your config sync folder is also outside of your Drupal root. And this is where you can set all that up. Let's say I showed up earlier where we were pulling in an external repo for a module. I can set up to where if I pull in a custom module, I can set up the path for that. I can set it up in web modules, contrib, or custom, where a typical Drupal module would go is in the contrib folder. And this can get a little bit more complex depending on whether you have stuff that's locally included in your Git repo, you're pulling from GitHub for certain things. But it basically manages all of that. And then this is one of the really great things, this final thing as far as the JSON structure is maintaining your patches. So how many of you have some sort of tracking system to keep track of the modules that you've patched or the core patches that you've applied? How many of you have some system of keeping track of that? How many of you have patched modules in core and stuff like that? Okay. One of the things with Drupal 8, especially right now, is there's still some bugs, especially in relation to certain things. I don't know of a project with Drupal 8 right now that I don't have at least one core patch applied. But one of the problems with previous versions of Drupal is keeping track of what you've patched. So when it comes time to update, some people have a text file where they keep track of the patches they've applied. Some people have a directory where they stick the actual patch file. But so you can keep track of what changes you've done. I'm not talking about hacking core or hacking a module. I'm talking about patching it. But you have to have some way to keep track of changes that you've applied to some sort of contrib package. And that's what this looks like. I mentioned that there's the composer packages earlier. We have a preferred install source. And here we have some examples of some patches that you can apply. And basically, you specify, like here would be a patch for core. Here would be a patch for module. Here, I've applied a patch for the JavaScript library. So this is maybe a situation where I actually need the library to be a little bit different, but I don't want to start maintaining my own version or own copy of that library. I'm able to apply the patch, and the core thing is still untouched. So when I run Composer install is going to go through and apply these patches for me as basically part of the build process. Composer update is also going to run that. Go ahead.
So if I have like, I'm pretty new to Drupal, but we have some custom HT access rules. Apply them here when I do the Drupal update and make an update, or is that kind of?
No, you would actually include your HT access file in your Git repo, and then when you updated core or something like that, that's where I mentioned you want to run like a git diff and compare things.
I can't automate that.
I highly recommend taking the time to look at those. Your HT access file, if that's not right.
I'm just saying there's only like, it's like 6 lines, they never change,
Yeah.
They're always the same.
And that's it, is they don't change all that much. Those files don't really change all that much. When they do, there's usually a good reason for it. One of the really nice things with Composer installer update, let's say that I've put a patch in there, and now I want to run Composer update on that particular module that's being patched. I can set the flag of dry run, which is basically Composer is going to go through the process of applying that patch. Or let's say I have a patch that's been applied, and now there's a module version update out there, but it doesn't include the fix for my problem. Okay, I went through this recently. The 8.2 to 8.3 versions in Drupal, I had a patch that I had applied to 8.2, and there wasn't a patch for 8.3. So I went through, I ran Composer update, Drupal core, dry run. It comes up and says, I can't apply this patch. So what that tells me right there, without having to go through any sort of testing or anything like that, it means that I need to stay on 8.2 on that particular project until there's a patch for that problem on 8.3. Or let's say that there's a module version update, I run the dry run, it clears. That likely means that that patch was able to be applied and that functionality will still be there, and then all I got to just go through is maybe have it go through and do some testing. If you're not doing unit testing, you can go through and test that manually. But this is really nice because all of your patches are right there in one place. If you run it and the patch can't be applied, it will basically just tell you it's skipping it. But if you don't run this, you can have a lot of stuff in your command line, and it could have said that it didn't apply that patch and you don't see it. So anytime you have a patch on there, it's usually a good idea to just run through this for everything that you're patching, for everything that you're updating, and just to make sure that that Composer is able to pull in and apply that patch. So this removes a huge headache in a lot of different ways. And I've seen a lot of problems in Drupal sites because somebody set up some sort of process for maintaining patches. It's a manual process and it gets forgotten about, or some new developer comes in and doesn't know about it, because it's not something that you're doing really a lot. In Drupal 8 right now, it's really common to have a lot of stuff patched because it's still on that verge of stability. In Drupal 7, it wasn't really all that common. It could really easily get forgotten about. And yeah, in the earlier days of Drupal 7, it was much, same sort of state as what we're in with Drupal 8 today. Any other questions on the structure before we move on?
This is patch description. Are we correctly? We remove patch description.
Yeah, so here, what I would typically do is I would put in the issue number and a description of what the patch is doing. That way, when I'm going through and updating modules, I have some reference to it. Some people will actually put in the URL to the actual issue itself, which isn't a bad idea. When I'm going through and updating, I can just immediately look at my Composer file, go out and look at it to see if that's been resolved and is included in the latest version that I'm pulling in. But this is a really nice structured way of maintaining those. And patches are still a very integral part of Drupal 8 right now. We have several modules that we probably have 5 or 6 different patches applied to make them usable. Anybody else before I move on to the next part? We've got, I think, 10 minutes. Okay. So I don't know how easy that is to see from here, but this is the Git structure that we set up for maintaining it. The top up here where we have config hash, that is your default config export directory. It's typically under your site's site directory, which they don't really recommend having it there. A lot of people want that outside of the Drupal root. It doesn't have, it's only used basically during the deployment process. It's not necessary for the functionality of the website other than deployment. So we move that out, and then the sync folder. When you set up a Drupal 8 site, you'll see a config, usually underscore, and then there's a hash. I don't know if it's a MD5 or an SHA or whatever, but there's a hash that's unique to the site. And then inside of it, there's a sync folder, and that's where all of your config export YAML files get stored. And you want to include those in your Git repo. I also install Drupal console instead of globally. In fact, the next version of Drush 9.0, will not have a global install. It will only be project specific, and the idea is that you can actually set up some custom drush commands, aliases and everything that's particular to your site. So it's a lot easier for somebody who's just stepping in to get a project up and running. They don't have to get their local drush, their global drush all configured and everything and set up. That's all included in the project now. So console drush, inside of this, you can actually specify your drush aliases for the site right there, and that's stored in. And I'm not going to really get into how that works. That's a bit of a little bit more of a different conversation. If I was doing a presentation on drush, I'd get into that. But you can also set up some custom drush commands, aliases, shortcuts, different things like that in there. Scripts. This is the folder where the scripts I mentioned earlier, as far as automating in the deploy process. That's where they get stored. Your vendor directory. This is where all of your dependencies, your Symfony, your PHP dependencies get stored. You don't want to include this. Composer manages that. You don't need to include it. Including it, all that really does is that means more work anytime you update things. Those are more things to look at as far as, okay, I've got to do git diff on these. I've got to make sure everything's get checked in. It's not necessary. That's just more work for you. Web, this is what I use and what is recommended is your Drupal root. So we want that included. But core, Drupal core, you don't. That's managed by Composer. If we went back through into that require section, right here, we are requiring Drupal core, and I use the latest minimum, like I guess major version. So if I ran Composer update with the tilde sign here, it'll pull in the latest version of Drupal 8.3 if I ran Composer update Drupal core. But because I'm including this in my Composer project, I don't need to include it, excuse me, in my Git repository. It's not necessary. We have modules. We're going to include the modules root folder, but we're not going to include contrib. Once again, all of the contrib modules that I'm using are included in my JSON file. Composer manages those. Composer will pull them in. And the Composer lock file makes sure that I have all of those things that are necessary, all the proper versions. Because really, you having contrib modules in your Git repository, okay, I'm going to update it, but really, are you going to go through and diff every single different version or different change inside of the code when you update a contrib module? I understand if you're looking for certain functionality and everything, you might. If you've hacked it, yeah, you're probably going to worry about that. But patching it, Composer handles that for you. You don't have to worry about those. You can go through and look at the change log to see what's changed on those. Custom local, I would include this. Let's say I've got just a special module that I'm maybe developing for a particular site. I want to include it right now. Once I have a module actually ready to go, then we move it off to its own repository and include it and let Composer manage it as well. And custom, I don't include that because, like I mentioned, those are ones that are getting pulled in via a repository through Composer. So instead of me having to worry about, okay, let's say I've got 5 different sites. I'm not running a multi-site. I've got 5 different sites that are using a custom module that my company has developed and uses on those 5 different sites. Checking those in and out, or doing git diffs and making sure everything's in your repository. It's a lot easier to just pull in the repository of that module. Somebody works on that module, checks it into its repo, and then the next time that everybody runs Composer update, it's going to pull down the latest version of that It's just a lot simpler and easier to handle. It also helps you keep from getting in situations where, oh, I've got 3 sites that have got the most recent version of this module, and I've got a couple other sites that have older versions, and I have to go through and do that. Unless you specifically want that, but then once again, you can go in and change the version inside of your Composer JSON file and set it there instead of doing it through Git. Now, in your sites folder, all of that you want to have checked in. Your settings file, services, all of that sort of stuff. Your example settings. This is the one that you don't. How many of you use like a local environments or local settings file in Drupal 7? How many of you have a concept of that have a concept of what that is? So just really quickly for those that aren't familiar with it, this is basically like my the password username for my local instance of MySQL, or local variables for your site. You can set it up in here to enable specific modules on dev, or on local, or on QA, or on production, all depending on environmental variables. This is the standard in Drupal 8. I've seen it a lot in Drupal 7, and it pretty much was considered the best practice. This is so that when you pull a site local, you don't have to have the exact same database name. You don't have to be using the same password as what you're using on production, or you don't have to go in and modify your settings.php file to have it work for you. Development services, example sites, those you want to include. Profiles, these are like the minimum or standard, or a lot of other of the contrib Drupal profiles that are out there, basically pre-configured Drupal configurations. I don't really see a reason for including any of those. If I'm going to go through the effort of developing one, it's probably not going to be for just one site. So I probably want to have that file or that profile in a repo somewhere where I can pull it in once again and include it through my JSON file. Themes, same thing as the modules, and then any other file that's in your Drupal root, I recommend including. Like I said, if I just clone the Drupal, if I do a drush create project Drupal/Drupal, it's not going to pull in any of those files, I think, except for the index.php file into the root of my Drupal. That's all done through an external scaffolding project or done manually. Those files are not actually included in the Drupal package. And then pretty much the very last thing, we're out of time. This is just to have this here, and I wanted to include it in the video of this. This is the Composer JSON structure for a module, and where we had for the actual Drupal site, where the type was project, here we have Drupal module. And that's what helps it be defined when we go into the JSON structure, into the installer paths where it says Drupal module. So if you're building a Drupal module and you want to have it included, if you're going to send that out, contribute it to the community, you're going to want to create a Composer JSON file for it. And basically, most of what that's for is just containing some metadata information, license information, contact information about you as a maintainer or other contributors to the project. This also helps when somebody's doing the Composer search to pull up that information about the package that they might be installing, so they can maybe verify that, yes, this is the package I want to install. Anyways, that's it. That's all I've got. Anybody have any other questions? Or?
You said you had these slides on website, right?
Yes, these are all on slides.com. This is I forget what JavaScript library, but yeah, these are all available publicly online, and I wanted to include it at the beginning in case somebody wants to go and reference them.
Would you, because I always forget that number right now, would you just push it to Slack when you think about it?
Yeah.
Just
I'll be.
Those are great. I mean, those are great cheat sheets you made. So that's
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.
So.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Everybody, yeah, wouldn't mind making your way down to the auditorium. We're gonna have a raffle.
Here's a quick closing session and raffle for some prizes. So definitely come. I don't know what it looks like this year, but in years past, we've given away some pretty awesome stuff.
Yeah.